Every single tank is being changed again, and with some global changes to adjust the tank meta even further, you can bet that the tier list is shaken up. The armor buffs have made strong tanks even stronger, and the individual hero changes have made some mid-tier tanks insanely broken. So let's get into the list. If you're looking to rank up on your favorite heroes, check out the link in the description below to get access to a GameLeap membership. There are tons of guides and courses that can level up your game and help you get better, faster. Make sure to check it out and enjoy the video. It's a sad start as Roadhog is still in D tier. Getting his pigpen buffed is a good step in the right direction, but it's far from solving his problems. In total, the patch has arguably made him even worse, because the new 10 damage armor reduction now means his shotgun damage is completely cut in half. Body shots against armor now deal just 80 damage, and don't forget that Hog has no armor of his own. He may be feeding less ultimate charge this patch, but he can still easily die to simple focus fire. And speaking of feeding less ultimate charge, Roadhog himself now gets less ultimate from his own self-heal. It's also affected by the tank passive. Ironically, the only thing keeping Roadhog from F tier is his pigpen. It's what allows him to still one-shot consistently, because lately, he's not farming games because he's killing tanks with his super high shotgun damage. He's farming because he can get hook kills before anyone's even set up to focus him. It's mostly a skill issue on your enemy's part because Roadhog is so easy to scout, but it is a 20-meter hook. That's always been a really solid range, and plus, it's not easy to counterplay when it's only on a 6-second cooldown. So he's got some good stuff going for him, but it's just really hard to force him when playing against teams that are willing to counterpick him even in the slightest. Even though Roadhog is sticking around at his old spot, the next tank on the list has been massively changed. In C tier, it's Malga back in the dumps. 100% lifesteal sounds insane, but now that it's only a 3-second duration, even Roadhog can easily sustain the pressure from such a short overdrive. And of course, it now also gives less lifesteal and less damage reduction than before. Malga is still more well-rounded than Hog though, because even though they pretty much feed the same amount, Malga has the armor to slow it down and the range damage to avoid poke whenever possible. And it's a really good benefit to have your tank be able to zone fare so effectively. But even so, he's in C tier. A big change from being the #1 pro pick. And it's really because the new overdrive duration really reduces Malga's impact. He can still spam the same amount, but now that his main tanking ability doesn't tank for as long, he's just so easily matched even after forcing cooldowns. And it definitely doesn't help that both Reinhardt and Diva got their mitigation buffed, so way too many heroes can just completely tank the 3 seconds where he can fight without getting bursted onto 0 health. Hopefully they work on adjusting the aura and berserker passive more so his neutral is more interactive instead of just pressing a button and shooting the tank. Moving up to B tier, we're starting with Doomfist. Despite being the 3rd worst tank, he's doing really well. He may be completely dead in Malga's cage fight, but the new overdrive is way easier to force out and escape. So for Doomfist who thrives in constant chaos, it's really nice that you can get back in the fight super fast to keep slamming and keep farming shields and damage, and the occasional super punch for a clutch pick. Doom still struggles into the rest of the tank roster, mostly because he's so much worse in the tank head-to-head where he used to be decent. But no matter what, he's a dive tank. He's got the mobility to contest all parts of the map so you can always surround the enemy team. It's just hard to coordinate, especially when it's so much easier to play a dive tank with armor and more reliable cooldowns. They won't get poked out as easily, and they can support their team more directly. Doom still definitely works. There's just a staggering amount of armor to deal with every single fight. Focusing the tank might not be ideal, but when they've gotten this strong, you have to be able to contest them somewhat effectively at some point in the fight, and Doom just can't keep up. For the top of B tier, it's fittingly Orisa. Now back to being ahead of Doomfist. Now that almost every tank got buffed, it's a lot easier to just send it on the backline instead of focusing the unkillable frontline demon. But Orisa is still the ultimate counterpick, because her consistent damage, spin, and spear are ideal for peeling away the enemy tank. No other tank has 2 abilities for booping players away, so if you're against teams that need to get on your backline to kill them, Orisa is actually incredibly useful. Sometimes it's not enough to shield or matrix your team because a lot of heroes can pierce right through. And in bad matchups where the enemy team can break your armor and force all your abilities, Orisa now keeps up the pressure better than before. Fortify's increased duration makes it easier to juggle your cooldowns again. If you still want to play Orisa this season, you need to be dealing a lot of damage to squishies. Now that you can't farm the tank, it's much more important to zone the enemy DPS with your spear and spam. Next up, we're already moving into A tier. That's 2/3 of the tank roster in A tier and above. And it makes sense because tanks have been power creeping for a good while. First is Wrecking Ball. Whenever the game gets to a point where tanks aren't worth shooting anymore, it's always good to play the tanks that don't want to focus other tanks anyway. Ball's damage, range, and mobility are all amazing for constantly pressuring enemies and forcing abilities. And of course, sometimes the best hero to pressure will be the tank, but even that's not as much of a waste as before, because the faster reload in Ball form is extremely good for his uptime. You can empty clips left and right, all while waiting for the opportunity to slam or boop for a kill setup. Catching and killing Ball is also really difficult compared to countering him when he commits his slam, and now his normal spam neutral has improved, making it even less necessary to risk your health to set up your team. The game is in a really good state for Ball individually, but the composition itself, Ball Dive, needs your team to adapt to not having a front line. Sometimes the map makes that impossible, and sometimes your teammates make that impossible. Ball is definitely A tier though. Making mistakes is more punishing than on other tanks, but it's worth it when he can carry games hard with high damage uptime and low deaths. Next in A tier is Junker Queen. She's really gotten juiced up since the last time she was meta, but it's not enough to take over or even hit S tier. She even loses to Orisa pretty consistently despite handling her other matchups better than before. Even so, when it comes down to it, Junker Queen sets her team up, keeps herself alive, and deals good damage. She just does it in the least oppressive ways compared to the rest of the tank roster. Her only utility is her knife pull and speed boost. Everything else is just healing, overhealth, and damage. It's not very flexible, which is why she's also so counterable, but just like Wrecking Ball, she's extremely good at killing squishies. But if you're not a dive tank, it's not easy to set up on the backline. 25 more health on the shout just isn't enough to ignore the tank and run right through. It's a lot of half wins for Queen, but she's in a really good state and way more playable overall. At the very least, she's the last tank to be called out for being too broken this patch. She really has a tough time into armor and is still pretty strong. Moving on to the top half of A tier, we finally got Zarya. It's true that her bubble is a really volatile ability. Just 2 buffs and she's gone from tragic to totally playable. She's a very balanced tank at this point. An 8-second cooldown for a 2.5-second duration is really good value, especially when you're constantly regenerating the ability. The only real hurdle you have to overcome is having teammates that can take advantage of your bubbles aggressively. No mobility and a low total mitigation of just 450 damage is just something you have to deal with as a Zarya player, but you can still win against your counters and top heroes when most of your bubbles are used to proactively pressure the enemy team, whether it's bubbling in a Genji on the backline or a Tracer for the flank or duel. Zarya doesn't fit in with the frontline tanks, which is definitely a good thing for her gameplay, but it means you have to play more coordinated and safe compared to the top tanks that easily outclass her in the resource trade. The number 2 spot in A tier goes to Winston this time. His changes were a lot less impactful compared to some of the big winners this patch, but still very positive for his playstyle. Regardless, his armor pull and armor piercing damage along with his ever so useful bubble make him a top tank for dealing with any situation still. He can cleave stacked brawl teams, isolate flankers and off angles against spam, and control the whole map against dive. He would be S tier just for being so reliable if it wasn't so easy for spam comps to break his bubble. With heroes like Pharah and Cassidy being so consistent, it's really tough to stick around. The counterplay to getting your bubble broken fast is taking fairer fights, like not jumping in 1v5 for example, and instead opting to fight for space on the sides of the map. But in the current meta, pre-fight spam is really high, and even though Winston has great mobility, he still needs time to set up, and that's the time he can get spammed out. He's much better at matching other tanks than before, but he doesn't have so much armor that he can just ignore all the high burst damage coming in from the top DPS heroes. Finally, for the top hero in A tier, it's Reinhardt. He's truly become the king of close range offensively and the king of shielding defensively. Every part of his kit has been polished up, so the only thing you can really complain about now is that he still needs Lucio to fully unlock his potential. But even so, he has so much armor and so much shield that it's extremely easy to keep sustaining pressure throughout the whole fight. Dive maps will be dive maps, and he still won't work well when high grounds become more important, but his raw shield health is just so good that you can definitely rotate your whole team wherever you want. You just need to set it up and then shield them through. He's not game breaking even at the top of A tier, but he is way more flexible thanks to the ability to regen 1600 shield health in 10 seconds. He literally fits right in with spam teams just because of how good his shielding is. No Lucio required. At the end of the tier list, we've got S tier, and first up is the wildly improved Diva. The devs have been changing a lot of things that haven't been touched up for a while, so increased matrix uptime was probably to be expected. But so far, it's definitely too good. Breaking Diva's armor was already impossible, and now this new matrix even makes her playable into Pharah again, so she's holding on to her insanely high survivability and her massive burst damage this patch. It doesn't even matter that she deals 50% damage into armor. Right now, she's even the most rounded dive tank, so you can just mark the tank when needed and run right over squishies when needed. She's got the mobility, and now an even better matrix to accommodate that, so things have only gotten better, way better in fact. You've got a lot of matrix shards to deal with, but of course, she doesn't win the frontline trade just because of it. Sigma comes through with a grand total of 0 armor at all. His kit is just that good. As the number 2 tank, his shield and matrix combo is always mitigating hard, and all of his damage is barely impacted by armor, especially his hyper buffed rock damage. That's how he can easily win against Diva. The buffed rock actually makes him a lot more even with the tanks who can beat him too, and it obviously makes him way more lethal to everybody else now that his one-shot combo is back for squishies. Right now, he's not just good at spamming. He can get up close and survive doing it, so he can even compete against the number 1 S tier tank. But thanks to the latest buffs, Ratra still takes the top spot. Extra damage and extra armor, he could already block a massive ton of damage for his team, but now he's even more deadly thanks to the extra punch damage. With all the tanks getting buffs, it's a lot more valuable to focus DPS and supports now, and Ratra is the best frontline tank for doing that. His Nemesis form punch range can reach into the backline for really impactful damage, and even his Vortex can pass right through the tank onto them. This patch, Ram definitely has the biggest advantage, which is fitting with his hybrid playstyle between spamming and brawling. That's it for the tank tier list for mid-season 11. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.